Hi, and welcome to the second episode of Criminal Justice Natters with me, Ed Johnston. On today's show, we are joined by Chris Daw Q.C., who is the author of the best-selling book Justice on Trial. Today, Chris will be talking about his route into a career in law, and we will be picking apart some of the elements of his book that looks at radical reforms of criminal justice. In particular, we talk about how we will tackle the issue of drug crime and the problems with the dark web and how it's possible to purchase or view illicit material, and as well as getting that through customs and getting it into England and Wales. Hence, it's a massive problem for the police. I do have to apologise. There are some visual issues during the video, but I think the audio quality is fine. So apologies for that. I hope you enjoy the video. Hi, Chris. Thanks for joining us. So how did you get into criminal law? What was it, something you always wanted to do as a child, or did it develop later?
No, not at all. I don't think I ever knew what a barrister was until I was sort of 16, 17 years of age when I became a sixth form student, and I went to the careers centre one day, and they had a computer where you could put in what you like, what you don't like, to do with. I'm sure they still have the same things now, and the computer in those days, it spat out a printout, and the printout told you, what careers were suitable for you. And there were only two options that the computer gave me, and one was being a barrister, and the other was being an actor.
Okay.
And that was it. So I didn't really know what a barrister was. I'd seen sort of barrister characters, I suppose, in TV dramas and so on, but that was about it. I didn't really think about it as being a proper job. I'm not sure. I still think of it as being a proper job, but anyway, having been told by the computer that this was one of the options for me, and probably lacking the talent required to become an actor, or indeed the desire to be perpetually skint, I went off to the Crown Court to watch a series of trials in my summer holidays in between my first and second year availables. And I just absolutely fell in love with it. I watched murder trials, I watched drugs conspiracies and all sorts of fascinating cases. And I watched the barristers all dressed up in the fancy dress and the drama of the whole thing, and families crying in the public gallery when their husband or son was convicted of murder or acquitted of a drug deal, of a drugs conspiracy. And I just thought, wow, this is just unbelievable. This is an actual thing that you can do as a job. And so I went back in the September to start the second year, and we were going into university applications at that time. And I decided to apply to do a law degree because I thought this is the only job for me. Having got the bug, having been sort of infected with this enthusiasm and the joy and the drama and the excitement of it all, I just knew this is it. I've got to do this, and I've been doing it pretty much ever since, in one form or another.
Excellent. It's a really interesting journey. What I found over the summer, I remember seeing some tweets from you pushing the sort of pre-publication of the book, but what I really enjoyed over my summer reading was Justice on Trial, and a lot of it sort of resonated with what I teach our students at UE on criminal procedure and punishment. But how did you get into writing a book and thinking this stuff needs to be to a wider audience?
Well, that's a really good question. And once again, there was an element of sort of chance involved in it, because I had for a long time been developing some thoughts around the legalization of drugs. And I'd just seen time and again drug trials, drugs cases where the sentences were getting longer and longer, and yet we were seeing more and more gang violence, murders on the streets, more and more overdoses, particularly of children and young people taking drugs and not realizing what they were taking, as well as some of the highest rates of drug-related death and violence in Europe. And so I kind of had all of this in my head, and I wrote a short piece for The Spectator at the beginning of last year. I think it went out in about February, March, in The Spectator. It was just a one-page article about drug legalization. And then a few days later, I got an email from Bloomsbury, the publishers of both me and Harry Potter, as it happens. And although sadly I don't make quite as much money as J.K. Rowling after writing my book, but But they sent me an email. My now editor sent me an email saying, we really like the article in the Spectator. Can I come and see you about a book possibly? So I said, of course. So they came to my chambers in London. Jamie, who's my editor, and someone else from the team, and we sat around the table for a couple of hours and talked over what else I might be interested in, what other kind of ideas and passions I had. And within 2 or 3 weeks of that, we put together an outline of what is now Justice on Trial. I can't even remember what it was. And then within a couple of weeks of that, Bloomsbury had commissioned the book, and I had to deliver a manuscript by Christmas. So, I had, I think, about 8 months altogether, something like that, from signing the deal to delivering the first draft of the manuscript to them, which eventually, as it happens, I did in early January. But having travelled around the world, as you know from reading the book, in the meantime, I decided to go on some research trips all over the place. And it was a fascinating process, and I absolutely loved writing it. And the liberation it gave me to talk about stuff that you don't normally get to address in day-to-day legal practice was fantastic.
Is there going to be a second book?
Oh, definitely.
Excellent. That's what
I love writing a book. Well, as you may have gathered, having read the book, the epilogue is about the dark web and about the kind of, the development of technology and the developments of organised crime in the sort of in cyberspace, so to speak. And that's a subject which has yet to permeate to a huge extent into the criminal justice system itself. Much of it is supranational. Much of it isn't susceptible to conventional law enforcement techniques. There's a lot of anonymity involved, the use of cryptocurrency. So I think that's a subject I'm fascinated by. So I'm planning a research trip to Russia sometime next year, where a lot of cybercrime takes place, and there's an awful lot of hacking and other kinds of illicit activity. And where that journey will eventually take me, and what form a book will take, I don't yet know. Given that my book's only been published 4 months, and there's still, there's still next summer the paperback will come out, and there'll be a whole range of activity around the launch of the paperback. So I expect to get seriously into writing something in a year or so's time. But in the meantime, I'll be researching and thinking, but I think the dark web and the sort of the future of crime is something that I think could be the subject of book number 2.
And that brings me on to one of my questions that I was going to ask you toward the end. In the epilogue, you describe the dark web as having like sort of Amazon-like convenience. For some of our viewers who won't know what the dark web is, can you maybe explain what it is that you can get on there?
Yeah, the dark web is a part of the internet that you can't find via search engines. You can't access via Google. You can't. It is a completely different platform from the conventional internet that we're all used to searching and finding things on. And so as part of the book process, I found someone who knew about the dark web and you have to use a special browser, you have to use a VPN, which anonymizes your identity and hides your location. And you are then able, once you've gone, it actually doesn't take very long. It took about 10 minutes to get from start to finish. And then you're in. And once you're on the dark web using one of these special browsers, which can be a bit clunky and they're not quite as sophisticated as we're used to using Chrome and Safari and such like, but eventually, without too much effort, you get to what is effectively a menu of services and products that you can buy at the click of a button using cryptocurrency of one kind or another. And they include weapons. They include drugs of any variety in any form, and they are sent, and they will send them anywhere in the world. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of crooks on there, and a lot of people get ripped off, but that it is just like going on Amazon, where you can buy a book or you can buy pretty much anything on Amazon. Well, anything that's illegal you can buy on the dark web. And so, as I say, even things like human trafficking. And all sorts of sexual services and extreme child pornography, pretty much anything that is against the law, you can access on the dark web, and you can pay for it anonymously, and it will be delivered to any address that you choose, or of course you can access stuff online if it's that kind of content. So
Yeah.
it's beyond the jurisdiction of most law enforcement agencies, because there's no way of finding out who's there. I mean, there have been cases, and I talk about one of the cases, the Silk Road, which was one of the famous kind of early dark web cases, which was where the founder of that case was, that website was brought to justice in the US and is now serving life without parole. So there have been examples of people being caught, and that was a very clever operation. And they only caught him, I think, because his laptop was open, and the FBI went and managed to get a laptop that was still open and hadn't been locked down and hadn't been secured by a password, and they were able to then unravel the whole thing. But the truth is that 99% of activity on the dark web, they get away with it, and drugs are just being delivered in much the same way as your parcels come from Amazon, and they are full of cocaine or heroin or pretty much anything else that people might want to buy. And even more worrying in some ways, certainly to me, is that they will offer to ship firearms, and what they do is they break those firearms down into individual components. They don't ship a whole firearm at once, and they send the bits separately in 10 or 12 or 15 packages, so that if one of them doesn't get through, they can send you a replacement, but people can then put the whole thing together and build themselves a gun anywhere in the world. And hence we are seeing an increasing number of firearms on our streets of Britain, even though the use of and possession of firearms is clearly a very serious crime, but they're getting them out to people in a way which is very, very difficult to detect.
Yeah, because I noticed in the epilogue, one of the adverts for a gun had almost like a guarantee that it will pass through customs. And what I was going to ask you is, how is that possible? But I suppose if they're breaking the weapon down into small component parts, it's far easier. So
yeah, they can get you a replacement. Like I say, if a bit's missing, they can send you the bit that's missing. But you know, we live in an age when technology has so many benefits to our lives, but also the more sophisticated technology is, the more anonymous you could be using that technology, the more that criminals are going to exploit it. So it's a fascinating area to me. As you know, most of the book is about, you know, the current criminal justice system and the work that I've done in the criminal justice system over 25, 26 years now. And much of that you might call analog crime. You know, it's kind of, you know, it's old-fashioned physical crime, supplying drugs, committing armed robberies, committing murders, etc., in the physical world. Whereas the next generation of crime, and indeed the current generation of the most sophisticated crime, is very much you know, out there in the kind of cyberspace and using techniques which are really, really difficult to track down, and it's going to create a major problem for law enforcement going forward.
I suppose this is an extremely difficult question to answer, but what could law enforcement do to crack down on this stuff that's being bought from the dark web or being shipped into England and Wales? I mean, are there any potential solutions to combat this problem, or
well, yes and no. I think it's very difficult to combat encrypted payments. It's very difficult to combat the sort of the websites themselves. But there are technologies around which will allow scanning of pretty much all parcels coming through the system, and then the application of artificial intelligence to the scan or the X-ray or the contents, whether it be in terms of the visual appearance of a package, whether it be a range of sensors that can detect certain smells or substances without use of dogs, for example, which is very labor intensive and difficult. So in terms of drugs, yes. In terms of firearms and other objects, obviously, if you are able to scan and see an object, it might look innocent in and of itself, because it might be a relatively small component of a weapon. But of course, if the database and the data is good enough, then artificial intelligence will be able to tell you that in fact is the firing pin from a particular weapon or a type of weapon. So that, you know, but the way that crime has always worked, particularly organized, serious and sophisticated organized crime, is that the criminals tend to always be one step ahead of law enforcement. Otherwise, crime would be wiped out. You know, particularly serious criminals, they are very good at what they do. And because the profits to be earned from organized crime are so high, then there will always be the incentive to create ways to bypass law enforcement. And let's be frank, in recent years in Britain in particular, law enforcement budgets have been so severely cut that we just don't have the policing resource to go after serious organised crime, and to have, the organised criminals are better resourced, are better equipped, and have access to better technology than the police in many cases. And that's going to be a problem if we don't invest in law enforcement, or indeed, of course, if we don't do some of the things I suggest in the book, like legalizing drugs, so that actually the whole drug market could be deconstructed and put back together again in a much safer way.
So with the legalizing of drugs, are you suggesting that all drugs should be legalized so they can be taxed and controlled and things like that? And as you say, taking the dealing off of the street and legitimizing the purchasing?
No, I'm not suggesting taxing drugs or having a commercial or private supply model as you do, for example, with alcohol and cigarettes. That's not the way I would go with drugs that are currently controlled drugs. My kind of philosophy around drugs is that you look to models that work, and the models that work best are where you regulate and license the supply of drugs rather than legalize drugs. So the way in which legalization, for example, of cannabis has proceeded in the US has largely been to legalize it, or decriminalize it, and then just let the market get on with it. Let people supply drugs in shops, let them advertise it, let them put packaging on which is commercial in nature, and let them make the strength as high as they like without any regulation of the product itself. And that model is not one I would adopt, particularly not for drugs which are inherently potentially more damaging, such as cocaine and derivatives of cocaine and potentially heroin. For those drugs, I would advocate a licensed dispensary system so that people would go to a dispensary, but it would be a state licensed dispensary. It wouldn't be a for-profit model. The minute you start making profit part of the equation, the problem is that you will then create a market incentive for dealers to carry on in business, to try and undercut whatever the cost is to the state or through the state network. And drugs themselves are, most people may not realize this, I point it out in the book, but drugs themselves are very, very cheap. Most drugs cost almost nothing to grow the plant that they're made from, or to synthesize them in the case of drugs like MDMA. The cost comes because they are prohibited. You have to then have all of these layers of illegal activity. You have to account for the fact that there'll be large numbers of seizures by law enforcement. And there's so many people making a profit at every single stage that by the time the drug gets onto the streets, it's very expensive. Whereas to buy pharmaceutical heroin, for example, or pharmaceutical cocaine, either of those products, or indeed just pure cocaine at source out in South America, or heroin, it's a couple of $1,000s a kilo, if that, in some cases. Whereas it's, by the time it's been cut and the profit's been added to it, it's 100,000 plus on the streets of America or Britain. And so the government, of course, can go and buy the drug at the £1,000, £2,000 a kilo, and probably a lot less because of bulk purchase and because of licensing, etc. And that means that the government can actually set the price precisely at the level which is high enough to disincentivize extreme levels of usage and extreme addictive levels of usage, but is low enough to mean that illicit competition can't thrive and survive because there's no need for it. And the government, the only way that drug regulation and drug legalization in inverted commas works is if it's regulation of the quality. So that means the purity levels, that means all of the other health warnings, information that users need to have, but it also critically means regulating the price.
And do you think that there would be an appetite for such a shift in approach to the war on drugs?
I think there's an appetite for a certain limited range of pragmatic solutions. Interestingly, I think there's a growing appetite for the legalization of cannabis following on the American experience and various other countries, such as Portugal and other places where cannabis has been, and indeed in Portugal, other drugs have been largely decriminalized. I think there's an appetite potentially politically around that, although I actually find it quite worrying that we may end up with a US model where people could just get really strong cannabis with no control, and that isn't the model I would go for. But the only other glimmer of light that I see in the drug reform agenda is around heroin-assisted treatment, which is being introduced on a trial basis in Glasgow. and is being introduced potentially in various other places. And that's the system that I saw in practice in Switzerland, and which I describe in some detail in the book, where heroin users get to go to a clinic every day, twice a day, most days, and they are given prescription or pharmaceutical grade heroin, which is very pure product, where there's a known purity, and the dosage is adjusted depending on the individual, weight, height, all sorts of other things, and indeed level of dependency. But they don't have to go out and find drugs on the streets. They don't have to buy drugs. They get they get the drugs for free. And the consequence of that has been a dramatic fall in drug-related crime in Switzerland, and a dramatic fall in drug-related deaths, such as overdose. So when you take those two things, and the overall cost, even including buying the heroin, which I've already told you is very cheap, is considerably less than the cost of the previous sort of law enforcement model, picking up the pieces, trying to proactively arrest heroin dealers, dealing with murders on the streets as a result of gang war and so on. So the cost in economic terms is much lower. The cost in terms of human life is much lower. And the benefit in terms of the society living in a more peaceful way without drug wars going on all over the place is obvious as well. So it's a no-lose policy.
Yes.
Save for those who would have some moral issue with the state dispensing heroin. But, we did that in Britain up until in the late 1960s. Anyway, that was our kind of very successful way of dealing with heroin as an addiction, was that doctors prescribed heroin to users, and we had a couple of thousand at most in the late 60s, early 70s. Then we prohibited effectively that process, and we outsourced heroin supply to the organized crime networks, and within a decade we had 300,000 heroin addicts in this country from up from 2000. So and that of course has continued to this day, and we still have enormous problems, health and otherwise, with heroin. And so heroin treatment, I think, could be something in the short term. Legalization of cannabis, I'm slightly more concerned about how that would work, but I can see that happening. The rest of it, I'm not so sure.
Okay, thank you, Chris. If we could talk about prisons, perhaps, for a little bit. Obviously, that a lot of the book, tackles the issue of prisons. If you were asked to describe the state of the regime of both inside the prison and the idea of how many people we are sending to prison in a short sentence, how would you describe that?
Well, taking them in reverse order, we have double the number of prisoners that we had when I started in practice in the mid-1990s. So we were around the 40,000 mark in Britain in the mid-90s, and we're now over 80,000. So we've doubled our prison population. We've seen the length of sentences increase dramatically on average, so that people are serving longer and longer for the same things. And in terms of the impact that's had on the prison estate and on prison conditions, well, I'll come to perhaps COVID in a moment and the impact of COVID, but set that aside, even before the present pandemic, what we have seen is dramatic levels of overcrowding across most prisons, something like 57% or so, and it varies obviously day to day, but around that level, 57% of our prisons are already overcrowded and some by a very significant amount, almost double the number of inmates that the prison was designed for. And that means you are creating quite horrific conditions, just living conditions on a basic level are massively overcrowded. But it also means that the prisoners in those prisons don't have access to healthcare or any of the other kind of basic sort of human rights, you might call it, really. Education, which has largely been shut down anyway because of COVID. But they don't have access to those things because there's not enough staff. The staff levels are largely based on the occupancy or the notional maximum number of prisoners rather than the real number, the overcrowded number. So the consequence for prisoners is that you just have longer and longer periods of lockdown in their cells. And if you think lockdown is bad for the rest of us, you want to try being locked down 23 and a half hours a day, as some prisoners are, with half an hour or an hour to go outside, and then you're back in again. You don't see anyone. So many prisoners in this country are currently living in conditions of solitary confinement, in effect, even though they are prisoners who should be going through education, they should be going through courses, they should be getting psychological and other welfare support, And those are the things in the end that may ease the path into a law-abiding life on the outside. Right now, people are coming out of prison, and the prospects of any sort of law-abiding existence are next to nil. And that's such a tragedy, because we're just churning people out. And interesting, I had a letter from a very senior retired judge just today that I was just reading before we started this interview. And he was a judge for many years and sentenced many, many people. And he says to me that his conclusion, and he's someone you should perhaps speak to for your podcast. But his conclusion after all of those years and going on all of those courses is that we've just had guideline after guideline, and sending people to prison in the way that we do is a complete and utter waste of time. And when a judge has spent a career kind of sitting on the bench and having to do what he's told and enforce the law as it stands and thinks, it's really counterproductive. And that should be telling you something. It's not a bleeding heart liberal approach. It's a rational, pragmatic approach that says the way we're doing it now and the way we're increasingly locking people up is so counterproductive that it damages our society, not just the prisoners, but it damages all of them.
Yeah. And I suppose if there's no, I completely take the point, the idea that if you're locked in the cell for 23 and a half hours a day during COVID, parts of sending someone to prison surely has to be to reform, rehabilitate, to teach, to equip you to live a law-abiding life once you have served this determinate sentence. So why do we just keep pumping people into prison? Like you say, if it's
it's a very good. I'm not going to out him on this podcast, but it's a very interesting question that the judge in his letter answered in very concise terms. And he posed the rhetorical question, why do we keep doing this?
Yeah.
And the answer that he came up with, and I have to say that it broadly must be right, is that the public want us to. The public think that ever-increasing sentences are somehow indicative of justice being done, even though the public don't believe that they're increasing, by the way. Most people think that judges are soft and
absolutely
too low, even though they've gone up and up and up, as I said. And anyway, you just look at the statistics, and they're very clear. And you can't have ever softer judges and then double the prison population.
No.
It doesn't really make much sense. But the public, generally speaking, in my experience, including when I filmed for the BBC for my TV series last year, and was out and about speaking to all sorts of people, including those who've been victims of crime, but the public generally perceive tough, long sentences as something they want. So when politicians at election time, like Priti Patel last year and Boris Johnson as well, when they campaign and say, we are going to increase sentences, we are going to stop early release, we are going to... I mean, stopping early release basically just means increasing sentences. Of course, it's the same thing. So we are going to effectively, if we have to, build more prisons and lock more people up. I mean, sadly, even Joe Biden, who, broadly speaking, is from the sort of centre-left of American politics, he was a huge advocate of the crime bill in the States, which led to the three-strike rule, mass incarceration, particularly of young black men, often life without parole. And so, politicians of every kind of persuasion, and the Blair government, much as I admired some of the things that they did, but the Blair government was equally responsible for that process of ratcheting sentences up. I mean, I told you, I've been in practice since the mid-90s. Well, 10 years, sorry, more than 10 years, 13 years at that time. So half of the time I've been in practice, we had a Labour government.
Yeah.
And sentences went up under a Labour government, just as they have done under Conservative governments, if not by even more. So why does it happen? Because the public keep voting for politicians and governments in particular that impose or that introduce these policies. And if we make it an issue in election time, and if politicians are told through the media and through the votes that are cast, this is not what we want by the public, what we actually want is to reduce levels of crime, then something might change. But at the moment, people believe increased sentences mean lower levels of crime. The truth is the exact opposite of that, as anybody who's studied this process, and hopefully anyone who's read my book will know.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Do you think we focus on sending the wrong people to prison? Should there be other alternatives before we start sending people to prison? For example,
I think we just overuse prison. This is the problem. I mean, the prisons, 69% of those in our prisons are in for non-violent crimes. So they haven't hurt anyone, they haven't assaulted anyone, they haven't raped or murdered anyone, they may have committed offences of fraud or low-level theft or burglary or drug dealing, but they haven't actually committed an offence of violence, like, let's say, like robbery or assault or what have you. So to lock such people up, when if your objective is to stop them reoffending, is the greatest act of insanity that you could commit, because history shows us, and indeed some of the individual examples of people I interviewed in the book, is if you take somebody of a relatively young and impressionable age, as many people are when they first go into custody, and you expose them to the prison environment for a non-violent crime, the person who comes out of prison is often someone with an addiction they didn't have when they went in. And it's someone who knows a lot more about committing crime than when they went in. And it's someone who comes out with absolutely no ability to go back into society, get a job and move on. Whereas if you work with people, particularly the young people and children, and as you know, I'm in favour of decriminalising all children, taking them out of crime and justice altogether. But if you criminalise people, it's the equivalent of, particularly when you put them in prison, it's the equivalent of tattooing criminal across their forehead, because not only will they see it every time they look in the mirror, but everyone they ever interact with will see it. When they apply for a job, they'll have to either disclose it or they just won't get the job, basically.
Yeah.
So the way we treat people now is to brand them as a criminal, often from their early to mid-teens, when they first become involved in being arrested and so on. And what we need to do is divert particularly children and young people away from that process. Let's not put that tattoo on their forehead. Let's say you're actually someone who needs help and guidance, and we as a society have an obligation to help and guide you, particularly if you're in the care system, as many in prison have been in the care system. Well, the care system, by definition, is something we're all responsible for, because children who are placed into care are placed into our care as a society and as taxpayers, and we are responsible for them. And I believe that it's a mark of a civilized society to take seriously a responsibility to look after children and their welfare, and criminalizing them, brutalizing them, and locking up in young offenders institutions, which are.
I'm sorry, you just broke up with that final point. Could you just repeat that last sentence, please, Chris?
Yeah, I was just saying that taking young people, often in their mid-teens, locking them up in a young offenders institution, which to all intents and purposes is a prison, is not the way to treat children who are in our care as a society. And to do by doing so, we make it almost certain that they will live a life without the ability to be a law-abiding part of our society. And it's our fault if we choose to treat them that way.
Okay, thank you, Chris. In terms of sort of looking forward, in terms of how criminal justice is going to go, have you had much experience sort of using virtual courts in sort of online justice?
Not online justice. I've appeared in court over the lockdown period, and indeed before, but particularly during this period, I've appeared in court on numerous occasions on the video system from home. I don't have the book in the background when I do so. I'm sure the judge would be too keen. But I have appeared in court in video hearings, and indeed I conducted a 3-week public inquiry in October entirely by Zoom. So I have got considerable experience, and I have to say, I think largely for most matters that the video system works quite well. I think it's quite helpful to be able to appear in courts, for example, that are a long way away without the need to travel. It's particularly helpful for defendants who may find it difficult to travel. I've used it for things like video linked to prison so that I can speak to a client in prison, whereas in the past I would have had to travel many hours and gone through the whole rigmarole of, an hour to get through security and everything else. So I can actually, in some ways, it makes it easier to interact with clients. Yeah. It makes it easier to interact and to conduct hearings wherever they may be. And it makes my life more efficient. I think the difficulty that's been faced in the justice system has been principally around the issue of trials, and jury trials in particular, which have basically almost ground to a halt. We have a small number going on, but I think we're still only at 20-30% capacity in the Crown Court. And that means we've just got an ever increasing backlog. of cases. Now, whether that will be the catalyst that we need for major reform, and asking ourselves, are we sending too many cases through the criminal justice system? I don't know. Frankly, I doubt it, because people are very much wedded to the way things are. But the reality of our current system is that we are way behind in terms of the caseload backlog, and we were way behind already before the COVID pandemic hit.
Yes.
And so, if anything, it's just a crisis. I describe the system as being at breaking point on the front of my book. Well, that title was decided upon long before COVID. So the system was at breaking point before this, and the system is now broken.
Yeah. In terms of sort of people's appetite for criminal justice, I think, it is front and center at the moment. If you think about like the Netflix documentaries, your own BBC documentary, that there is some sort of mainstream sort of just visibility for criminal justice issues. Do you think that might become even more popular if cameras were introduced into criminal trials, much like in America, and people can actually watch a trial from their home?
I think the impact of televisation depends on how it's done. I think having it as a sort of entertainment medium, where you simply have snippets of the juicy bits and doing it that way, I think would be perhaps slightly worrying. But I'm broadly speaking in favour of anything that lets the public see what really happens in courts, because there's so much misinformation out there. I mean, virtually every story that I've ever read about a case in which I was involved had some significant error of fact or law, or just simply misrepresented what had actually happened in court. And so, and that's journalists, who many of whom are experienced and perhaps doing their best, but also are trying to sell newspapers. Whereas I think if the public were allowed to see how trials work, the sentencing process. I mean, we've had filming of sentence appeals, but that's not exactly most people's cup of tea. It's a pretty dull process from a sort of television point of view. But if we were to allow cameras to film trials, particularly high-profile trials, but also some more mundane trials, and allow people access to the public gallery that they're allowed to access physically, but to allow them to access it virtually, I think that would be a good thing. I mean, the public gallery is a good place to learn about how things really work, the one where you have to sit down in the courtroom. But I think, in principle, I don't see why, if the public are entitled to see justice done, they can't see it done by a stream or a feed of cases, subject, of course, to protecting the anonymity of vulnerable witnesses and victims and so on, which happens happens now.
Yeah.
So, there are steps taken to preserve the anonymity, for example, of the victims of rape and other offences, and that would have to be done in a virtual court scenario or in a televised court system. But I'm in favour of, you don't write a book if you don't want the public to know what's going on. And one of the reasons I wrote the book was to tell people, this is how it really works. This is what I, as a defence lawyer, think about stuff. This is some of the opinions I've come to, and this is some of the cases I've been involved in. And some of the cases that I describe in the book, people will find quite shocking. I talk about a case in which I defended someone who'd shot 5 people. And it was a horrific event, and it was obviously particularly damaging to those who were shot or shot at. But people, that's what happens. I'd rather people understood and knew what goes on and understood why things happen in their name, than that they remain in ignorance and rely entirely on newspaper headlines or TV reports, which are often false.
Mm-hmm. I've had a question in from Stephen Davis, who's a solicitor at Tucker's. And it's
I know Stephen.
Yep. Hi, Stephen.
We had a couple of pints together.
Excellent.
Last year or year before.
He's a good guy. I've just written a couple of chapters in a book with him. Be out at Christmas. So Stephen asks about legal aid, and he says publicly funded legal aid work is unsustainable. Do you think removing legal aid from the sort of political football arena and creating an independent pay review board would make much of a difference in terms of making criminal law attractive to aspiring solicitors?
I think that's a good idea. I mean, the truth of the matter is, it would depend on how well resourced and what powers such a board have, because ultimately, whenever there's an independent pay review board, whether it's for teachers or any other profession, they make recommendations, and the government has to decide to follow the recommendations or not. And so, having a criminal defence review board to look at legal aid payments and legal aid rates, and perhaps to look at the viability of the profession generally. You know, what are we seeing enough young people coming through? Are we able to sustain criminal justice in the future? Looking at all of those issues in a sort of macro at a macro level would be great. But if they then went back and said we need another 2 billion, and the government said you're not getting the money, it's a pointless exercise.
Yeah.
So I do agree with it in principle, subject to there being funding available to pay for it in the end.
Yeah. Absolutely. I've got one final question for you, Chris, then I'll let you go. If you could pick one system of punishment or criminal justice from anywhere in the world, what would it be and why?
Well, it's interesting that you elided the concept of criminal justice with punishment, and of course they're very, very different things.
They are.
And it may or may not be apparent to your listeners that I am not a fan of punishment as a concept. I don't see that it has much value. I'm much more interested in how we reduce crime. And so when it comes to something in the criminal justice world that I think could have the greatest impact, I think the heroin-assisted treatment programs of Switzerland are amongst the most rational and pragmatic and productive reforms that you can have in any criminal justice system, because heroin is, generally speaking, one of the most deadly drugs and that causes some of the worst harms in terms of the impact from dealing and the impact from drug-related crime. So I would say that, you know, a regulated heroin-assisted treatment program would be the one thing that I've seen in action. I've watched the process for myself. I've seen addicts arriving and being given their heroin, and I've seen them in some cases go off to work after they've done so, and that's something you would never see in Britain. People who buy their drugs on the black market. So I think reform of drug law generally, but certainly heroin-assisted treatment in particular, is the one thing I would point to.
That's great, Chris. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
You're welcome, Ed, and really good to meet you, and good luck with the podcast.
Thank you, Chris. Take care. I'll speak to you soon. Cheers.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye. Many thanks for that talk, Chris. It was extremely interesting. I think we covered a lot of interesting ground that gives us, as the wider public, some food for thought. I think it illuminated some very interesting sort of cases and scenarios that need to be tackled in order for criminal justice to work. As I've said at the start, your book is now on sale. It's an excellent read if you're looking for stocking fillers for someone that's got an interest in criminal justice issues. You can find it in any good book stockists. Next week, my guest on the show will be David Rudolph, who was the lead defense counsel in the Netflix show The Staircase. If you have an idea for an episode or would like to appear on the YouTube channel, please reach out to me. I'm available on Twitter at either at Edward M. Johnston or the YouTube channel's Twitter feed at C Natters. You can also search for Dr. Ed Johnston on LinkedIn. I'll see you next week for David.